I have been talking about this for a number of years. I am, for a long time, I thought this was pretty futile. Couldn't see change, but I now see a lot of changes over the last 30 years. For example, one example would be the impact of seawalls on beaches, and the fact that ultimately seawalls will destroy beaches. It's variable from place to place. But and now that's an accepted principle that and for years it seemed like it was, and also the Corps of Engineers has kind of cleaned up its act, I think. So I'm very happy with all this kind of progress. I think that we have a almost a defining moment here with this current situation with the hurricane. I think we've been hit by a long-term double whammy. Sea level is rising, and and as Susan pointed out, we're going into probably a period of bigger storms because of the warmer temperatures of the water. The sea level predictions range from 2 feet to 10 feet. The probably the scientific consensus is 3 feet by the year 2100. Although 6 feet is becoming a bit more respectable because of the behavior of the West Antarctic ice sheet, where some of the glaciers have been lifted off the seafloor, and there's nothing holding them back now. So conceivably, we could have more than 3 feet. All of these predictions are based on a lot of assumptions, and if you go by assumption after assumption after assumption, it's kind of, you can see it's pretty fuzzy. But I think we should plan. We should be planning on a 3 foot sea level rise, and unfortunately the state of North Carolina is looking at a 30-inch sea level rise, which is nonsense. Anyhow, I just went on a field trip to what we call the Inner Banks, the mainland, the lowermost coastal plain of the mainland in North Carolina, around Albemarle and Pamlico Sound. And something really hit me reading about the Hurricane Harvey and what happened to the hospital, the famous Houston hospital. How it had a generator, it had walls of the sort that were preventing flooding. They survived beautifully, had no problems whatsoever. But all the streets around them flooded. Nobody could come and nobody could go, except maybe by boats, and even that was difficult because often it was too shallow. So, and what I noted here in the Inner Banks, and I think this goes for the lower coastal plain everywhere, is that although some communities have been, like Beaufort and Morehead City, have been placed by the early pioneers on former barrier islands from a higher sea level, meaning that the elevation is quite high. But the problem is, and this is really a big problem in the Inner Banks, is that the flooding, whether it be from sea level rise or whether it be from storm surge, is going to cut off the roads. It's going to flood the roads getting to these communities, for both the sea level rise and for storm surge. So these standard inundation maps that we often see, which are very useful, a 3 foot sea level rise will flood to this point here on a map, but we have to consider other things, which makes these maps a little bit misleading. You have to. I think they're very good. I wouldn't really criticize them, but there's more to it than would meet the eye. The other thing I saw was something that we learned heavily in Hurricane Floyd. What was that? 2005. Whatever Hurricane Floyd was the fact that roads act as dams. And most of the severe flooding in Hurricane Floyd in North Carolina was due to road dams, where the roads have been elevated. And throughout the Inner Banks, the roads are elevated 3 to 4 feet, something like that. And we know from some work by Stan Riggs of East Carolina University that these things have caused major flooding. And who would have thunk? The roads are elevated because they want to get out of the swamp, reduce the daily flooding from minor rains and so forth. So it makes sense. but it's creating a severe problem, both again for sea level rise and for storm surge. And another thing that's a little bit more subtle, and that is, I am convinced, for example, looking at Florida. Let me give you some numbers here. This is a study based on a 6-foot sea level rise, and it assumes that nobody's going to try to stop the shoreline from moving back, and that's not a good assumption. But this study said that 57,000 houses will be lost in North Carolina with a 6-foot sea level rise. But listen to this: Florida will lose 934,000 houses by the same 6-foot sea level rise. So we're looking pretty good in that sense. But 57,000 is not something we should sneeze at. The the point I want to make in this with these numbers is that how we respond to the rising sea and to the increase in storms, if we have in storm intensity, how we respond is going to be very important. If we end up building seawalls, which I think we will end up building seawalls, because we're not going to move big buildings. Big buildings will stay in place because we just can't let a high rise fall into the sea. We'll build seawalls, and then the beaches will disappear. Now, the beaches, when the sea level has risen 3 feet, you can't nourish the beach. The beach is way out of equilibrium with the level of the sea. So we're going to see areas in North Carolina, but particularly in Florida, where there will be massive seawalls. We're talking about something 50 to 70 years from now, where massive seawalls, and there'll be nothing else. It'll be like Cape May, New Jersey, during the early part of this century. There was never a beach there, but in Cape May, the thing everybody did was promenade on the top of the seawall back and forth. So I think that building big buildings next to a beach will eventually lead, in the long term, to the complete loss of the beach. What are we going to do in Florida with hundreds of miles of high-rise line shoreline? Let me say a couple things here that I think the federal government, we can see this really clearly, especially in Harvey. Federal government needs to make flood insurance actuarial. That would be very, very painful. Flood insurance would would go up very high compared to what it is now, and a lot of people couldn't afford it. But why should we, the taxpayer, pay repeatedly for this for flood damage when the people who have placed their beach house in a dangerous place? Why should we support them? The other thing is the Stafford Act. The Stafford Act says if a storm is named, then the federal government pours help in there. That's fine, but why do we pour help in there again and again and again? We have to stop, and things are going to get worse as sea level rises, especially, and the storm surge will go further and further inland. And the problem with flood insurance was $12 billion in debt already will get all the worse. The state of North Carolina, we need to pull our head out of the sand, so to speak. We need to take the long view. The idea of just looking at 30 years of sea level rise, which is about 8 inches perhaps, depending on who you believe, as the basis for our development regulations is just unsatisfactory and unacceptable. I think the Coastal Resource Commission and the legislature are basically promoting development in our coastal areas. More money, more happiness. We're building more bridges. We have more than $1 billion worth of new bridges that we're building to our barrier islands. We have a policy now that if you nourish the beach and the system gets wider, it's okay to build beachfront houses in that strip. And they've done that on 2 islands now. Every other state that I know of, including South Carolina, has prohibited that. And North Carolina led the nation in 1985 with installing a rule that you cannot build seawall. This is a fantastic thing that they did. Maine did it in the same year, in 1985, and several other states have followed. But we're losing our seawall rule. We keep picking away at it and changing it, and now we're getting more and more hard stabilization on our shoreline. And I think I'll stop there.
Great.
So it seems like you're advocating for not building these high rises, whatever it may be, on this coastline, but I feel like economists here will tell you that it brings a lot of business for North Carolina. So then what's the easy solution aside from seawalls?
Well,
is there anything that they can do?
Yeah.
Because I think they're going to keep building these places on the shoreline.
Well, maybe we shouldn't, but I understand exactly what you're saying. The if we have to build high rise, we can build them on the back sides of the island, give ourselves a little time. But the back sides of our barrier islands are usually lower elevation than the front sides. But building beach cottages, if the sea level rises, which it certainly is, moving or demolishing a beach cottage is easy to do, relatively speaking. Moving or demolishing a high rise is practically, in a practical sense, is impossible. And you can't, usually there's no place to move a high rise to. The lowermost coastal plain is very low elevation. So I think it's a matter of high rises. I am not totally against by any means building beach cottages, although we are pretty well have filled up all available space for beach cottages now in North Carolina. And I think now we should start considering moving some of them. But where do you move them? How do you move them across a bridge that can't take that weight? And if the island is full up, then you can't move them now. On Kill Devil Hill, very recently, I just happened to see this 2 days ago. They have a 20-acre space behind behind the Wright Brothers monument, and they're going to build how many? 78 houses on 20 acres. Now that's not on the beach, but that brings more and more people, which is fine just in itself. But that means sooner or later that those houses are going to be in trouble, probably 50 years from now. Should we worry about 50 years from now? Should we worry about what the next generation is going to be faced with? It's a difficult question. Not for me, but.
One quick follow-up. If I could, just one quick follow-up for that too. So for the seawalls, if those are built, then what's the environmental effect of not having the beach? Like once that beach is just gone?
Well, if you don't have a seawall, there's only two things. Either you let the house fall in, or you move the house, or you nourish the beach. Right now we're nourishing beaches, and we're doing a lot of nourishment here. Typically in North Carolina, it's hard. Typically, the beaches effectively disappear in 3 years. The longest live beach in the United States is Miami Beach, which is now essentially gone, but it lasted almost 20 years. But there's a big difference in the wave energy. The Outer Banks has higher waves, and the beaches disappear faster than they do way down in the southern part of the state, just because of a difference in the nature of the waves. But a significant storm can take out a beach in a day.
That was my question, but another question. No, not that one. The one about, because Dare County is spending, I think, $40 million on beach nourishment. They're just finishing that project. How likely could a storm come through? How likely that $40 million beach goes out?
The $40 million could disappear overnight with the wrong storm. More likely, it'll disappear step by step with smaller storms. If we had the Ash Wednesday 1962 storm, it would really go away. But all storms don't take out the beach. It depends on the nature of the storm, where it's coming from, its intensity, its duration. There are many factors in a storm. It's just like with a hurricane. If a hurricane came across the Georgia continental shelf and hit Georgia, we would have the highest storm surge ever in the United States, on the East Coast at least, because there's a very wide continental shelf. And off Cape Hatteras, the continental shelf, it's 80 miles wide off Georgia and 35 miles wide off the Cape Hatteras, something like that. And so the storm, because there's more space to take up the water that's being pushed ashore off Cape Hatteras, the storm surge would be less. This is another reason why sometimes the category of a hurricane, I think Susan kind of hinted at this too, that the category of a hurricane, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is only part of the story. A lot depends on where it goes ashore and how it goes ashore. If it's like the hurricane that hit Houston, if it's half of it stays on the ocean, that's a disastrous rain event. So.
You also mentioned roads. Hurricane Jose didn't hit directly, but it did cause some flooding along Highway 12. You mentioned the $1 billion move on a bridge. They talked about moving the bridge off into the Sound and bringing it back, but what's the impact in 2100 if we have 3 feet of sea level rise and increased storms? What happens to Highway 12?
One thing to look at is that we look at geologically is the slope of the land that this barrier islands migrate, and if we left them alone, they'd be migrating. And the average slope of the land in North Carolina is 1 to 2,000, I mean a 1 foot sea level rise, in theory, would produce a 2,000 foot shoreline retreat. Around the Outer Banks, a 1 foot sea level rise would move the shoreline back, in theory, 2 miles. So that gives you some idea. A 3 foot sea level rise, and I think you can basically say goodbye to much of the Outer Banks. The further south, the islands would there'll be still, but 3 feet would be a disaster for us in North Carolina. We are all, with the exception of a couple of short stretches like one at Curry Beach, we're all barrier islands. We're all sandy barrier islands, which is great. We have a wonderful coast, but it's also a very vulnerable coast. Yeah.
And do you feel like, is it too late? I mean, is the sea level rising faster than we can mitigate it? And if so, how do you remain hopeful in your research?
I don't, I'm hoping that this is a defining moment. That's what's happening today. What's happening now, in the last 2 weeks, and that we will really begin to see the cost of these 3 hurricanes, starting with Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, then the whole Florida column and whatever else is hit by these hurricanes, will be so immense, and the flood insurance program will go deeper and deeper in debt. That this may be this. I'm just hoping that this will be the event where we will come to our senses and say that we cannot repeatedly rebuild. And so I think, I have to say that we have a problem with the developers and with the real estate industry in North Carolina, a very strong one, kind of insisting that we don't really have a problem. But I have hope that this will be a defining moment, and that we will start look at the Stafford Act, look at the flood insurance program, and see, and I think if the flood insurance program is made actuarial, that will, first of all, it'll cause prices to drop at the beach, which may not be good, but that will happen. And there will be some people who will move because they can't afford it. There'll be a lot of people who move. But also the people at the coast at the beach and the beachfront tend to be pretty wealthy and very politically powerful too. I don't think I answered your question.
Mitigation. Is it too late to mitigate sea level rise?
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, there is no real mitigation except moving buildings. Beach nourishment is very temporary. Building a seawall, you lose the beach, which is the reason you're there to begin with. So, yeah, it's not too late to move, that's for sure. There are a few people that I've run into who have bought property for the purpose of moving their house eventually. These are pretty rare people. In the early days in Nags Head, the lots that were sold were 600 feet deep for the purpose of, one of the purposes was to move. Another purpose was that beachfront property wasn't that valuable then.
So I guess when you say we have a problem with developers and real estate industry in North Carolina, do you mean, I know you've talked about flood insurance and from an economic perspective, but do you also mean from a physical perspective of these buildings contributing to further erosion?
Is beach building,
I mean, yeah, I guess I know you have economic objections to development on the coastline.
Yeah.
But does the very presence of structures that close to the beach contribute to further erosion as well?
yes, it does actually. That's an interesting question. They've shown in New Jersey that the rate of densely, this is in the old days, they showed that densely packed beachfront houses cause beachfront loss, a rate of beach loss that was higher than adjacent property. But that's not basically the problem. There really is no, if we want to maintain okay, let's remember that about the time that we're going to have to nourish all of our beaches because of the sea level rise, so is everybody else down the coast and up the coast. So the cost, much of the cost of beach nourishment is federal at this time. In the Stafford Act, if your community is hit by a named storm, then you can have federal beach replenishment from there on, which is, but anyway. So we have to consider the whole coast when we look at our future. I think that places like Emerald Isle, which have many big buildings on it, are the ones that are going to be in trouble. The Outer Banks and Nag's Head, which has fewer big houses, I think is maybe in the long term is in better shape.
Reiterate the statistics you shared earlier about the amount of homes lost. That was
57,000 homes.
what was the time period for that?
What was it?
I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong, 57,000 homes would be lost in North Carolina if we get a 6-foot sea level.
That's right. This is a study that assumed, I should point that out, a study that assumed that we wouldn't build seawalls and just let the seawall, let the sea level go. That's not going to happen, but I think these are important numbers because they show the difference in Florida and North Carolina, how far out Florida has gone. Florida has a the very worst coastal management program in the nation, in my view, and they have a governor who denies global climate change.
What was your statistic for the
What
homes
were the
lost in
numbers?
Florida?
57,000 and versus 934,000. I'm sorry.
One quick thing. Are we in better shape than some of the other coasts? Because obviously it seems like Florida will have it much worse than we will, should we not really do anything.
I think we're probably on a par with South Carolina and North Carolina and South Carolina, pretty much on a par. I think they have Myrtle Beach. That's not a good thing in a sea level rise sense, and Virginia has Virginia Beach. So in that sense, we're doing pretty well, if you want to look at it that way.
Thank you, Professor Pilkey.